There are crimes driven by passion, by anger, by desperation that spills over in a single, unguarded moment. And then there are crimes that unfold quietly, deliberately, behind closed doors, where emotion is not unleashed but restrained. This story begins not with a body, not with flashing lights or frantic calls for help, but with a spreadsheet. Investigators would later describe the document as unlike anything they had seen before. Rows and columns carefully labeled. Variables defined. Outcomes weighted. Not a budget. Not a forecast. A calculation attempting to answer a question most people never allow themselves to finish thinking. What is the cost of being exposed? And what is the cost of making sure that never happens? Serena Dupree was an accountant, trained to measure risk, assess probabilities, and reduce uncertainty. In her professional life, she was methodical, disciplined, and trusted. Numbers were neutral. Numbers were honest. And numbers, she believed, could bring clarity to even the most uncomfortable truths. But somewhere along the way, the tools of her profession became something else entirely. They became a way to avoid reckoning with reality. As the case would later reveal, Serena did not stumble into violence. She did not lash out in a moment of rage. Instead, she approached her situation the way she approached everything else, by trying to optimize it. Faced with mounting secrets and the threat of humiliation, she began modeling outcomes the way a business models losses. Confession, exposure, consequences. Then, side by side, another column. Silence, control, finality. This is what makes the case so unsettling. The crime itself is almost secondary to the mindset behind it. There was no thrill, no chaos, no obvious malice in the traditional sense. What existed instead was a belief that mistakes were intolerable, that imperfection was fatal, and that reputation mattered more than survival itself. The math, of course, was wrong. Fatally wrong. But at the time, Serena believed she was solving a problem, not committing an atrocity. And that belief would become the foundation of one of the most psychologically revealing cases prosecutors had ever brought to court. This is the story of how perfectionism, left unchecked, can become something far more dangerous than failure. On paper, Serena Dupree's life looked orderly, even enviable. She was an accountant by training, someone who thrived in systems built on precision and predictability. Colleagues described her as reliable and meticulous, the kind of person who met deadlines early and corrected errors before anyone else noticed them. She didn't seek attention, but she earned quiet respect by being someone others could count on. That same discipline extended into her personal life. Serena kept a structured routine, avoided unnecessary risks, and presented herself as composed and self-sufficient. There were no public outbursts, no visible instability, no obvious signs that anything was out of balance. To those around her, she seemed grounded, even unremarkable in the best way. The kind of person whose life appeared settled and under control. But what those closest to her would later begin to understand was that Serena didn't just value perfection. She depended on it. Mistakes weren't inconveniences or learning moments, they were threats. From an early age, she had internalized the belief that worth was something earned through performance. Being competent meant being safe. Being flawless meant being acceptable. Anything less felt dangerous. Over time, that belief hardened into identity. Serena wasn't simply someone who did things well. She was someone who needed to do everything well in order to exist comfortably in her own skin. Failure wasn't something to recover from. It was something to prevent at all costs. And prevention, in her mind, meant control. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear how easily that mindset can turn inward. When control begins to slip, when reality refuses to cooperate, the fear doesn't always look like panic. Sometimes it looks like doubling down, tightening routines, compartmentalizing truths, convincing oneself that as long as the surface remains intact, the damage underneath can be managed later. Before continuing, if you're finding value in the careful, evidence-based approach to stories like this, consider subscribing to Beyond the Evidence. This channel focuses on understanding not just what happened, but how and why, with respect for the people involved and the realities behind the headlines. Because in Serena Dupree's case, the distance between who she appeared to be and what she was quietly becoming was growing. And the cost of maintaining that image was already far higher than anyone around her realized, even unremarkable. There were no reports of frequent arguments, no dramatic breakups, no visible signs of volatility. Friends and acquaintances saw a couple that functioned smoothly, sharing routines and responsibilities without friction. In many ways, the relationship mirrored Serena herself, calm, contained, and outwardly successful. But stability can sometimes be mistaken for closeness. Those who later examined the dynamics noticed how little of Serena's inner life was shared, even with the person closest to her. Emotional needs were managed quietly, kept private, and carefully regulated. Vulnerability was not something she practiced openly. Dependence, in any form, made her uncomfortable. Her boyfriend occupied a specific role in her life. He represented normalcy, continuity, and proof that Serena was meeting the milestones expected of her. The relationship reinforced the image she worked hard to maintain, responsible, grounded, and in control. It was not about dominance or manipulation in a conventional sense, but about preservation. As long as the relationship remained intact and uncomplicated, it validated the version of herself she needed the world to see. This created an imbalance that rarely announced itself. Serena managed details, handled logistics, and quietly absorbed stress without complaint. Conflict avoidance became a form of control. Difficult conversations were postponed. Unpleasant truths were withheld. Silence, for Serena, was not emptiness, it was strategy. If nothing was said, nothing had to be confronted. Over time, this emotional containment narrowed her options. When problems emerged, she did not reach outward for help or reassurance. She turned inward, relying on routines and private reasoning instead of shared reality. The relationship became another compartment, orderly on the surface, sealed off beneath. In hindsight, investigators and clinicians would note how this pattern limited Serena's ability to tolerate exposure. The idea of disappointing someone she cared about, of being seen as flawed or irresponsible, felt unbearable. Not because of anticipated anger, but because it threatened the identity she had built so carefully. This dynamic matters because it shaped what came next. When pressure mounted, Serena did not imagine confession as a path forward. She imagined it as collapse. And within a relationship defined by silence and control, the absence of open reckoning allowed fear to grow unchecked. The unraveling of Serena Dupree's carefully managed life did not begin with violence. It began quietly, with numbers that refused to balance. What started as small, private gambling losses quickly grew into something far more destabilizing. Each loss carried not just a financial cost, but a psychological one, eroding the certainty she depended on to feel secure. Serena approached the problem the way she approached everything else, analytically. She tracked the losses, rationalized them, and convinced herself they were temporary. Her training allowed her to reframe risk in ways that felt controlled, even responsible. Losses could be recouped. Errors could be corrected. All that was required was discipline and time. But the secrecy mattered more than the money. Admitting the truth would mean acknowledging recklessness, poor judgment, and failure, qualities that conflicted violently with Serena's self-image. So she hid the losses, not just from her partner, but from anyone who might challenge her narrative. Each concealment reinforced the belief that exposure would be worse than the problem itself. Early warning signs became visible only in hindsight. Serena grew more rigid in her routines, less flexible when plans changed. She withdrew emotionally, conserving energy for the mental labor of maintaining appearances. Sleep became irregular. Decision-making narrowed. Instead of imagining multiple outcomes, she fixated on a single objective, preventing discovery. Her professional skills, once a safeguard, now enabled denial. Spreadsheets that might have been used to confront reality were instead used to postpone it. She modeled hypothetical recoveries and future corrections, pushing the moment of reckoning further away. The longer the secret lasted, the more catastrophic exposure felt. This period is critical because it marks a shift. The problem was no longer the gambling itself, but the meaning Serena assigned to it. Losses became evidence of personal defect rather than circumstance. And when identity is threatened, logic can become distorted. By the time Serena recognized that the numbers could not be made whole, the fear had already metastasized. The idea of confession no longer represented accountability. It represented annihilation. And in that narrowing mental landscape, options began to dissipate. As the pressure mounted, Serena Dupree's thinking began to shift in ways that were subtle but profound. What had once been a problem to fix became a threat to neutralize. The language in her private notes changed first, less about recovery, more about exposure. Less about correcting mistakes, more about minimizing damage. Somewhere in that transition, morality stopped being the framework through which she evaluated her situation. It was replaced by optimization. Investigators would later determine that this was the period when Serena began modeling outcomes rather than confronting them. Faced with the certainty that her gambling losses could no longer be hidden indefinitely, she did what she had always done when overwhelmed. She reduced the problem to variables. Consequences were no longer emotional or relational. They were quantified. Financial ruin, professional disgrace, personal humiliation. Each assigned a weight, each treated as a cost to be managed. The most disturbing element was how methodical this process became. On her computer, Serena created spreadsheets that outlined hypothetical futures. One path involved confession, disclosure to her partner, professional fallout, legal and financial consequences. Another path imagined silence, permanence, and control. She labeled columns with neutral terminology, as though she were evaluating investment risk or long-term liability. What she was actually doing was attempting to solve a moral crisis using the tools of actuarial logic. In these documents, there was no language of anger or resentment, no expressions of hatred. The absence of emotion was striking. Instead, there was detachment. The kind that develops when fear has been normalized and urgency reframed as necessity. Serena was not asking whether something was right or wrong. She was asking which outcome produced the least perceived loss. This mindset is what experts later described as catastrophic narrowing. Under extreme psychological stress, Serena's world shrank until only two options seemed visible: confess and lose everything she believed defined her, or act, preserve the image, and move forward. The fact that one option involved taking a life did not register in the same moral register it would for most people. It was abstracted, sanitized by distance and calculation. The decision did not come with visible turmoil. There was no dramatic break, no outward sign of internal collapse. To those around her, Serena remained composed. She continued working. She maintained routines. That outward normalcy would later confuse many observers, but it was consistent with her lifelong coping strategy. If the surface remained intact, the structure could still stand. The act itself was planned with the same restraint. There was no confrontation, no spectacle. The poisoning was chosen precisely because it avoided chaos. It allowed Serena to remain in control, to avoid scenes that could invite scrutiny or emotional exposure. Investigators would later note that the method aligned with her broader pattern: indirect, quiet, and designed to minimize variables she could not manage. What matters most is not the mechanics of the crime, but the mindset that made it possible. Serena did not experience the act as violence in the traditional sense. She experienced it as resolution, a final adjustment to rebalance a system she believed had spiraled beyond repair. In her reasoning, this was not cruelty. It was necessity. This is where the illusion of logic becomes most dangerous. When human life is reduced to a variable, when accountability is reframed as risk, and when fear is allowed to masquerade as rational thought, the outcome can be catastrophic. Serena's spreadsheets did not reflect madness. They reflected a distorted but coherent internal logic shaped by years of equating worth with perfection. By the time the crime was carried out, Serena believed she had chosen the lesser harm. She believed she had contained the damage. What she could not calculate, and never truly accounted for, was the weight of irreversible consequence. Not just legal consequences, but the moral collapse that would follow once reality reasserted itself. The numbers may have appeared balanced on the screen, but the moment the act was done, the system she was trying to preserve was already beyond repair. In the immediate aftermath of the death, Serena Dupree did what she had always done when confronted with disruption. She maintained structure. She followed routines. She presented composure. There was no visible collapse, no dramatic deviation from her normal behavior. To outside observers, she appeared calm, measured, and quietly grieving in a way that aligned with her reserved personality. But control, when sustained under strain, requires constant effort. In the days that followed, Serena relied heavily on procedure to steady herself. She attended to practical matters with efficiency, responding to questions without embellishment. Emotion was carefully regulated, expressed only where it was expected and withheld everywhere else. This restraint did not immediately raise alarm. It fit the image people already had of her. What investigators would later note, however, was the absence of spontaneity. Grief did not soften her routines or disrupt her patterns. Instead, her behavior became more rigid, more deliberate. She avoided unpredictability, keeping interactions brief and factual. The same mindset that had guided her calculations now governed her responses. If she could control variables, she believed she could contain outcomes. Subtle inconsistencies began to surface. Not overt contradictions, but small moments where her narrative felt rehearsed rather than recalled. Details were precise but emotionally flat. When sympathy was offered, she acknowledged it politely but did not engage. To some, this read as shock. To others, it felt distant. At the time, it was easy to rationalize. People grieved differently. Serena had always been private. Behind that controlled exterior, the mental load was intensifying. The act she had believed would resolve everything had instead introduced new uncertainties. Medical questions, procedural timelines, interactions she could not fully script. Each development forced her to adapt, recalculating in real time, trying to stay ahead of scrutiny without drawing attention to herself. What made this period especially precarious was Serena's confidence in her own restraint. She believed that as long as she did not panic, she would remain invisible. That composure equaled credibility. But investigations do not rely on demeanor alone. They rely on patterns. And as days passed, those patterns began to attract quiet notice. The perfect exterior had not shattered, but it was under pressure. And for the first time, Serena was no longer the only one reviewing the numbers. As the investigation moved forward, it began to shift away from surface impressions and into something far more concrete. Routine procedures gave way to deeper examination, and attention turned toward digital records, financial activity, and personal devices. What initially appeared to be a case defined by circumstance started to take shape as something far more deliberate. When investigators accessed Serena Dupree's computer, they expected to find evidence consistent with her profession, budgets, forecasts, work-related documents. What they did not expect was the level of detail that would ultimately redefine the case. Among otherwise ordinary files were spreadsheets unlike anything they had encountered before. At first glance, they resembled standard analytical tools. But the content quickly made clear that these were not professional exercises. The spreadsheets outlined hypothetical scenarios laid out side by side. One column mapped the projected consequences of confession, legal exposure, reputational damage, financial ruin, personal humiliation. Another modeled an alternative outcome, framed in neutral terms that avoided emotional language entirely. Each scenario was assigned weighted values, as though Serena were evaluating competing investments rather than life-altering decisions. Prosecutors would later argue that these documents demonstrated intent, not impulsivity, not panic, but calculated foresight. What made the evidence especially powerful was its consistency with Serena's broader psychological profile. The spreadsheets were not chaotic or emotional. They were orderly, precise, and methodical. There was no language of anger or desperation. Instead, there was distance. An attempt to transform fear into something manageable by translating it into numbers. As investigators continued building the case, testimony from Serena's therapist provided critical context. In confidential sessions, Serena had described a deeply ingrained belief that her value depended entirely on appearing competent and composed. Failure, in her mind, was not an event, but an identity. To be exposed as flawed was to be undone. The therapist did not frame Serena as lacking empathy, but as someone whose self-concept had become dangerously rigid. This insight reframed the spreadsheets not as cold calculation alone, but as evidence of psychological collapse expressed through familiar tools. Serena was using the only language she trusted, logic and structure, to navigate a situation she could not emotionally tolerate. But in doing so, She crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. For prosecutors, the documents became central. They argued that Serena had demonstrated awareness, planning, and conscious evaluation of consequences. For the defense, the same evidence raised questions about distorted reasoning under extreme psychological pressure. The court would ultimately have to decide how much weight to give to intent versus impairment. What was no longer in doubt was this: the crime was not accidental, and it was not sudden. It was the result of a sustained internal process, one that unfolded quietly over time and left a clear digital trail. The spreadsheets did not just document a decision. They revealed a mindset where human life had been reduced to a variable, and morality had been replaced with probability. Once that evidence entered the record, the story changed. This was no longer a case defined by suspicion or demeanor. It was defined by Serena's own calculations. And those calculations would now determine what came next. When the case reached the courtroom, the atmosphere was notably restrained. There were no shocking revelations left to unveil, no dramatic reversals. The story had already been laid bare through documents, timelines, and expert testimony. What remained was the task of assigning responsibility for actions that had been carefully planned and quietly executed. Prosecutors built their case around intent, returning again and again to Serena Dupree's own work. The spreadsheets were not presented as abstract thought experiments, but as evidence of conscious decision-making. Each formula, each weighted outcome, was framed as proof that Serena understood the gravity of her actions and proceeded anyway. The argument was simple and devastating. This was not confusion, it was calculation. The defense did not deny the documents existed. Instead, they contextualized them. They pointed to Serena's psychological rigidity, her inability to tolerate imperfection, and the distorted reasoning that can emerge under prolonged stress. Expert witnesses described how extreme perfectionism can collapse into tunnel vision, where fear masquerades as logic and alternatives disappear. The question before the court was not whether Serena committed the act, but how to understand the mind that led her there. Throughout the proceedings, Serena remained composed. Observers noted the same emotional restraint that had defined her before the crime. There were no outbursts, no visible breakdowns. But this control no longer worked in her favor. In a courtroom, composure did not signal credibility. Evidence did. And the evidence was overwhelming. The verdict marked the end of Serena's attempt to manage outcomes. The consequences she had tried so desperately to avoid, public exposure, professional ruin, permanent accountability, arrived all at once. The life she had structured around appearing flawless collapsed under the weight of its own rigidity. What stands out is the irony. Serena's efforts to minimize loss resulted in the greatest loss possible. Not just of freedom, but of meaning. The system she trusted could not protect her from moral reckoning. And in the end, the logic she relied on became the very thing that condemned her. When the facts are stripped away, when the evidence has been weighed and the verdict delivered, what remains is a question that lingers long after the case file is closed. How does someone who appeared so controlled, so capable, arrive at a decision so destructive? The answer, in Serena Dupree's case, is not found in anger or malice, but in fear, quiet, persistent, and deeply internalized. Serena's story is not a cautionary tale about gambling or even about crime in the conventional sense. It is a psychological portrait of what happens when self-worth becomes conditional. When identity is built entirely on appearing competent, mistakes stop being survivable. They become existential threats. And when exposure feels equivalent to erasure, the mind can begin to justify the unthinkable. The spreadsheets that defined this case were not just evidence of intent. They were evidence of isolation. A person trying to solve a human crisis alone, using tools never meant to carry moral weight. In reducing life to numbers, Serena removed empathy not because she lacked it, but because empathy complicated the equation. And complexity was something she no longer believed she could afford. There is a broader discomfort here, one that extends beyond a single individual. Modern culture often rewards perfection, while offering little room for failure. Success is curated. Mistakes are hidden. Vulnerability is postponed. Serena's actions were her own, and the harm she caused is irreversible. But the pressures that shaped her thinking are not unique. This case forces a difficult reflection. What happens when people believe they must appear flawless to be worthy of safety, love, or belonging? And how many silent calculations are being made every day by people who feel trapped between who they are and who they believe they must be? If you have thoughts on this case, about accountability, about perfectionism, or about the psychological cost of never allowing yourself to fail, share them respectfully in the comments. And if stories like this matter to you, consider staying with Beyond the Evidence, where the goal is not to sensationalize tragedy, but to understand it. Because sometimes, the most dangerous errors aren't emotional outbursts or reckless choices. They are the quiet decisions made in isolation, when perfection leaves no way out.